and thank you, Miss Eck, for inviting me to run this course. It's actually a course that I've taught for 3 years at the University of Lincoln. I'm a lecturer at the University of Lincoln, a small university somewhere in the sort of northeast of England that maybe you haven't visited before, but it's a growing, a burgeoning institution. So I've taught this course for 3 years so far to undergraduate students in their 3rd year. So when Miss Eck asked if I could adapt it for Hayashen, I tried to pick from the overall 12 weeks that I usually run it over 6 different portions of the course that I thought might translate well into a shorter course. So it's going to be a sort of a trial and error this year, I think, to see what works. But I'm especially glad to hear that there are people with ancestry from Western Armenia or Turkey, and also Russia and Iran and all over the place. So that will hopefully give us lots of different opinions and perspectives on the topics that we'll discuss. So who am I? I mentioned already I'm currently a lecturer at the University of Lincoln. I've been there for, I think, about 5-6 years now. And I lecture in it's now called the School of Humanities and Heritage, so it's a mixture of subjects including history, philosophy, classics, and so on. My area of research is actually art history and architectural history. I've worked for a long time on Armenian architects in the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, particularly the very famous example of the Balyan family of Armenian architects working for the 19th century sultans and constructing these famous illustrious buildings on the Bosphorus, the Dolmabahce Palace of 1856, a series of mosques and additional palaces and pavilions. So that's sort of my main area of research on which I've published on. But also, since I completed my PhD, I spent 3 years in the city of Mardin in southeast Turkey, close to the border of Syria. And since I was based there for 3 years, I carried out fieldwork on the role of Armenian architects in rebuilding cities in that region. So although I'm traditionally focused on Ottoman Istanbul in the 19th century, more recently I've been looking at sort of eastern borderlands, Ottoman provincial cities, and the roles of Armenians in those cities, particularly in the construction sector. So yeah, that's a brief background to me. I think you've all introduced yourselves briefly already, but hopefully we'll have lots of discussion throughout this course, and we'll also have refreshment. Excuse me. We'll also have refreshment sort of breaks distributed where we'll get to know each other pretty well too, hopefully. I have to apologise for my cough. I had the influenza about 2 weeks ago, and it still hasn't disappeared, unfortunately, so hopefully I'll manage to keep it under control with sips of tea and water. I'll give a bit of background about the course, what the approach is, and then I'll go into what we'll actually focus on today. So the course, as I mentioned before, it's a broad survey. At Lincoln I teach going from the medieval period of Armenian history and giving some background on the aspects of Armenian identity and mythology from the medieval period to then build up to focus on the 19th century in the Ottoman Empire and Russian Empire. And then I end looking at the Soviet period. So with a brief interlude looking at the First Armenian Republic and the Turkish Republic. So it's a very broad survey. We look at lots of different periods. And when I teach it at Lincoln, it's a sort of introduction for people who don't have any background knowledge about Armenians whatsoever. So that's the reason why it's so broad and why we'll look at diverse periods and geographies in the history. We look at, in particular, identity construction, so theories of nationalism, theories of national identity, how they can be applied to the Armenian case, how they can perhaps better help us understand different periods in Armenian history, and the changes that Armenian identity has undergone. We look in particular at cultural means of identity production and how group membership and group identity were created through cultural means. That's primarily because I'm an art historian and an architectural historian, so naturally I look at architecture, painting, and other kinds of art forms, and how these can be particularly powerful in bringing people together, giving them a sense of solidarity, and a power in perhaps a difficult environment. We also look, because we look to the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the Turkish Republic, all these different political settings, we look at how Armenians adapted to these settings. So to what extent did they assimilate the culture that was around them? To what extent did they retain their difference in these changing contexts? And we also will look at activism. So how do Armenians raise their voice at different times, whether through cultural means, through producing a pamphlet to raise attention about the Hamidian massacres in the 1890s, or through staging an art exhibition, for instance, to collect money for the genocide victims. So we'll look at how they raise their voice in different communities at different times, but also retain this focus on cultural methods of activism. As you can see from the topics, you've probably seen the poster already, so I apologise for how small the type is. So we move through chronologically from today. We will discuss medieval and early modern communities. It's a bit of a gallop today, just to give some backstory to what we'll focus on later on, really, in the 19th century and early 20th century, because as I sort of briefly mentioned, many of the myths and the stories and the bases of identity come back later in the 19th century and are foregrounded at that point. So that's what we'll look at today. I'll go into more detail in a minute. Next week we will focus on the Russian and Ottoman empires in the 19th century and how Armenians took on crucial roles in relation to the Ottoman and Russian courts. And we'll focus on the cultural position, in particular the role of architects, painters, and also other intermediaries at the courts. After that, we'll look at Armenians in Britain, and this will draw on some of my research that has gone into the activities of Armenian antiquities traders in 19th century Britain. So it will relate, some of these weeks will relate more closely to my research than others. But we'll also look at the very famous Armenia, I've got an image of it on the next slide, here we go, Ararat pamphlet that was produced, that we have a copy of here at Hayashin, I think, according to Miss Ak. I haven't seen it, but hopefully we'll get to see that in that week when we discuss Armenians in Britain, because this was a very important publication that was created in Britain at the time of the genocide to draw attention to the Armenian difficulties at the time. So we'll look at Armenians engaged in cultural activities and also activism in Britain, particularly around the time of the Hamidian massacres and the genocide. And at this sort of, let's say, radicalisation from being perhaps people who had come to Britain to take part in business and to transfer their business activities from the Ottoman Empire that was becoming more and more fraught, and then how they got drawn more and more to political activism due to the events that were unfolding in the Ottoman Empire. Then in the fourth week we'll look at the impact of the genocide and to what extent this was a change in direction for cultural production. Particularly we'll look at the rise of the Neo-Armenian style that came about. The Neo-Armenian style is a sort of Armenian revival style that was consciously reviving Armenian medieval architecture, and how this became popular in Paris in the 1920s and 30s in particular. So we'll look at the different kinds of culture that came about in the aftermath of the genocide and why these styles came about. Then we'll look at Armenians in the Republic of Turkey, in particular after the genocide, the creation of the Republic and the Treaty of Lausanne, how did they reorientate themselves in relation to the new state and the Turkification policies. So we'll largely draw on recent books by Lerna Ekmekcioglu, Talon Sucian, and people like that, and discuss how Armenians adapted to this very fraught new situation. And then in the final week we will look at constructing Armenianness in Stalinist Yerevan. So we'll look in particular at the works of Alexander Tamanyan, and we'll look at the dynamic between his works and Stalinist works elsewhere. So what aspects of his works are Armenian, a revival of traditional Armenian models, and what aspects of his work actually have quite a large overlap with Stalinist architectural works elsewhere. So to what extent can we understand Yerevan as a Stalinist city? And then we'll look at how these aspects of Stalinism have been dismantled in more recent years. So that's a brief outline of what we'll cover. As I mentioned, I'm an art and architectural historian, so I will focus on that kind of source material. We'll look at statues like the statue of Stalin in Victory Park in Yerevan, and the toppling of that statue and its replacement with Mother Armenia. And this is an aspect of the detail of the entrance to the military museum that's underneath it. So we'll focus on this kind of material culture evidence. We'll look at, as I mentioned, this pamphlet called Ararat. So we'll look at pamphlets that were produced by Armenians in various communities, particularly those that were using culture to engage in activism. We'll look at architecture from the Ottoman Empire. This is the dome, the interior of a dome of a church that was constructed in 1838 in the suburb of Beşiktaş in Istanbul. So we'll look at sources like this to try and piece together how the Armenian community in the Ottoman Empire was presenting itself, both to internal audiences and also to outside audiences. And we'll look at quite a few textual sources as well. So this is just a document from the Public Record Office in Kew, and it's the Foreign Office correspondence of a consul who was stationed in what was called the Kurdistan Consulate, and he was writing his notes about what he was observing there. So we'll look at these kind of sources as well, which I use in my research. So it's a heavy focus on material culture, but it's also some texts here and there where relevant. So, as I mentioned today, we'll focus on the medieval and early modern background in order to familiarise ourselves with some of the sort of building blocks of Armenian identity that come back later in the 19th century, and some of the discussions about Armenian culture that have been taking place in recent years that have been applied to the medieval and early modern periods, and then we'll come back to them later in the more modern periods that we discuss. So this is the lesson plan. I'm not sure if we'll adhere to this. When I was putting this together, I was sort of thinking that this session would involve a lot of discussion, so I put these short sort of slots together interspersed with lots of discussion. But I've since been informed that discussion might not work that well in such a situation, so we might sort of shunt the discussion to the end of a bigger portion of looking at various sort of sources and me talking. So the short of it really is that we aim to have each week a session of 2 hours. The first hour will usually be devoted to one topic and the second hour to another. Today it's covering a lot of material because we're looking at medieval Armenia in the first hour and early modern Armenia, that is the merchant communities of New Julfa and India, in the second hour. We're treating it, as I said, as a sort of gallop through just to give the essential context really for the further weeks and to bring up some initial ideas that we'll continue to discuss through the course. So I will just, I think, start. Oh yeah, also in terms of, I think Ealing Council, we need to have lots of sort of pragmatic information about the skills that you're gaining. Hopefully, as a result of attending, you will be able to engage in academic discussions about national identity and Armenian identity. So we'll discuss some content about theories of nationalism in a minute and transfer them to the Armenian case through our discussion. How to use visual sources and historical texts as evidence, so we'll do some analysis of buildings and building plans, and looking at some texts as well if we have time today. Problems in the interpretation and display of Armenian heritage, so how have some of these works been interpreted traditionally, what might be some issues with those interpretations, and what are more recent interpretations. And also we'll start to think about a theme that runs through the course, which is what difficulties have Armenians in various communities experienced in communicating to the world about the issues they're facing, about the difficulties they're facing, and making their situation sort of understandable to the outside world and relevant. So if we get time, we'll discuss Joseph M. in that context. I think Misak has already mentioned about this learner survey, so we won't do that now. And we will just start with medieval Armenia. So something that I always do in the very first class when I teach this course at Lincoln is I show my students the video of Mer Hayrenik that is broadcast in Armenia, or at least it used to be broadcast at midnight on public television. And I asked the students to watch the video, and just as an introduction to some of the symbols of Armenian identity. So for an outsider who doesn't have a clue, where is Armenia, what are the building blocks of Armenian identity, this is quite a succinct introduction to some of the, let's say, visual cliches, we could say. So perhaps let's watch it very briefly now, it's only a couple of minutes long, and then it will provide a talking point, hopefully in a minute. Okay, should work.
It's on YouTube. So.
Yeah, it's on YouTube. So I probably saw that for the first time around 2016, and I was sort of flabbergasted by it, by the fact that it was on TV at midnight every night, and I just found it, a very, very conservative set of symbols that were being projected to everybody at midnight. And I didn't really understand why there was this focus on such a select body of symbols, really. The monastery, the Armenian highlands, perhaps a few shots of the city of Yerevan, and the military at the end. But it was mainly monasteries, it was mainly aspects of Armenian medieval culture. That led me to focus on investigating why these aspects of Armenian medieval culture were so powerful in Armenia today. They continue to be so powerful. That is partially because they are, what remains, the rich aspects of cultural heritage that do remain. That is also, I think, to do with the closed border and the lack of access to Armenian culture outside in Western Armenia, perhaps, which may have shown different kinds of church buildings or different kinds of culture that weren't accessible due to those political constraints. I just find it an interesting visual to show my students at the beginning of the course, just to give them this background that these symbols are important. So why are they important, basically? That's something that we think about in the course. And so I used that as a sort of stepping off point to start to think about nationalism, theories of nationalism and national identity. So there are four main theories. I'm sure you're familiar with these things already, so I won't go into a lot of detail about nationalism. Primordialist, perennialist, modernist, ethno-symbolist are four of the big ideas within nationalism theory. Primordialists believe that nations are natural divisions of humanity and have always existed. So they're the kind of nationalists that say that Armenians have always been inhabiting the Armenian plateau going back to the time of Urartu and these kind of ethnogenesis type explanations. So there's the idea that national nations can be silent and exist within people until they're awakened. So perhaps lots of these aspects of national identity have always been there, but then in the 19th century they got rediscovered through intellectual endeavours. And some scholars, such as Clifford Geertz, argue that primordial ties can exist in the form of blood relations, speech, customs, religion and territory. So it depends on what scholar is discussing these primordialist beliefs as to whether they believe that they genuinely exist or they were sort of imagined or recreated at some point. But most hold that there are some certain primordialist aspects that are given aspects that contrast with the civil nature of the modern state and modern aspects that were created later. They are particularly powerful characteristics, these primordialist aspects, because they are felt by the humans that possess them. And the members sense their long-held nature. So these aspects are believed to have been held by the community since the beginning of time, and for that reason they have such an attachment. An example of this kind of belief, perhaps, is the connection of Mount Ararat with the Armenian people, and the idea that this connection shows descent from Noah and from these biblical actors. So this could be an example of a characteristic that has existed since the beginning of time. Another categorization of nationalism is the perennialist perspective, which says that some nations have existed for a very long time, not since the beginning of time like the primordialists, but for a pretty long period, perhaps even millennia. And there's a relatively small group of these nations which could include the Armenian nation, because it had various aspects that could be described as national aspects, such as the creation of a alphabet and a state religion and so on in the medieval period. So that's another category. The third category is the one that has been the most popular in recent years, which is the modernist perspective on national identity and nationalism, which views the nation as a recent phenomenon that came into existence following modernization and the Industrial Revolution in particular, and also the French Revolution, when, as this famous painting by Jacques-Louis David shows, a new idea of the nation came together as the union of citizens. So all the deputies are giving their vote, their will towards the central figure, showing the union of the deputies in the form of the political nation. Modernists also say that a number of symbols were created in the modern period that were necessary for the nation, such as the national anthem, the flag, and so these aspects are all obviously 19th century or later in terms of their genesis. The final interpretation that has come forward as a sort of synthesis of the modernist and the primordialist interpretations is ethno-symbolism. And this takes into account the pre-existing cultures and ethnic ties alongside aspects that were created in the 19th century, and says that nations are complex creations and hybrid creations, and they include aspects that are perhaps going back to a very old genesis and perhaps even since the beginning of time, and that they're combined with modern aspects that were created in the 19th century or even more recently. And this is helpful for us, I think, particularly in the study of Armenian national identity and nationalism, because it considers popular as well as elite sources, and so this allows us to understand the deep-rooted nature of many of these beliefs, and why dying for the nation becomes possible, or at least, why it is so important to associate Armenianness with a relatively small body of symbols, or collection of symbols. So I think we'll discuss at the end, but I do look forward to hearing your perspective on lots of these points. So I'll jump forward to look at what some of the medieval building blocks of Armenian identity are believed to be, linking back to some of the images that were shown in the Meir Hayrenik video. So the first building block of medieval Armenian identity could be, so this is the idea of building blocks of medieval Armenian identity is actually taken from Razmik Panosian's book, where he discusses why medieval Armenian identity had this importance for later 19th century rediscovery and revival of national identity and the rise of nationalism at that point. So he prioritizes this idea of building blocks, and these come from his book, Razmik Panosian's book. So the first building block, according to Panosian, is the conversion to Christianity. So this is based on Agathangelos' account that was written down in the history of the Armenians. So it's significant that this was written into a text, and that's how it was primarily passed down for posterity. This has been used to sort of prioritize the idea that Armenia was the first Christian nation in the past, but this has been increasingly disputed by historians like Robert Hewson, who have said that in reality it seems that the conversion was more like contemporary with when Constantine converted. So in the past this has been a building block of Armenian identity because it was highlighting Armenian difference and Armenian, foresight in being the first nation to convert to Christianity, but the significance has slightly shifted as the historical realities become clearer. The second building block of medieval Armenian identity is the invention of the Armenian alphabet. So this is again according to Razmik Panosian's book. So you all know the story of Mesreb Mashdot, who was requested to make a new alphabet because the letters of Assyrian origin were deficient. So he had this dream in which the letters appeared as if from God. So again, there's a sort of a notion of Armenian difference because Armenians needed a different alphabet, and also there's a notion of Armenians being a chosen people because the alphabet came directly from God. It was revealed from God himself. And it's also significant that, again, this account was written down and passed down to us in the form of written histories by Mashdot's pupil, Koryan, and then included in Horonatzi's history of the Armenians. So that's the second building block. The third building block is the paradigm of rebellion. So this includes the legend of, or the story of Vardan Mamikonian, who was the general who led the Armenians in their fight against the Persians at the Battle of Avarir in 451. And Vardan Mamikonian was praised for his braveness, but sadly died as a martyr. So again, it comes back to the fact that this was written down by Yekishe. So for that reason it was preserved for future generations. It preserves an idea of Armenian difference again and struggle between Christianity and Zoroastrian Persian identity. And it also starts to promote this idea that martyrdom has a place in Armenian history and identity. And that, the struggle against the other is the most important struggle and the noble struggle, let's say. The fourth building block is more about genealogy and the connection of Armenians to illustrious ancestors. It's about Moses Horonatzi's Armenian history, the first history of the Armenians, in which he chronicled the history of the Armenians from the beginning of time to the 8th century in which he was writing, although he claimed to be writing in the 5th century. It was based on oral histories and a number of histories that he compiled, but he asserted it was based on received tradition, and so it was sort of an authentic version of the Armenians' genealogy and their relationship to illustrious forefathers, including the relationship of Armenians to Noah and Haik, the father of Armenians. So that again, it's significant that it was written in a medieval history that was passed down to us. Again, it foregrounds the difference of Armenians, I suppose, and illustrious lineage, and the fact that they come from the chosen people of the Bible is a continuing theme throughout this as well. And there's, to some extent, also a tragic element in the stories that were included in the history of the Armenians, including some of the ones portrayed here. So I think, again, we might skip over the discussion. And we'll move on to Armenian medieval culture. So I thought, given the context of the building blocks that we just looked at, we can think, and given the context of the video that we watched as well, and the foregrounding of certain rather restricted images of Armenian medieval culture, perhaps we can try to reassess how we might otherwise view Armenian medieval culture, how we might broaden out the horizon a bit more. So, an article that was written in Apollo magazine by Tim Greenwood in September 2018 was complaining about precisely this situation. He says, probably you can't read it, it's a bit small. I was intending to bring handouts, but if anybody wants a copy of the PowerPoint afterwards, then please just contact me and I'm happy to give you one. In this article, he is, I'll read you the paragraph because it's quite well written and it relates to what we've just been talking about. So he says, the title of the article is what the art of Armenia can tell us about a place and its people. So he says, being Armenian in the pre-modern era held a multiplicity of meanings despite the persistence of traditions that sought to present it as unchanging and singular. The latter included the belief that Armenians were descended from the eponymous figure of Haik, despite the dubious etymological link. The classical Armenian term for Armenian is Hai. That they comprised the first Christian nation after the healing and conversion of King Turdat by St. Gregory the Illuminator in the early 4th century, and so before the conversion of Constantine and the Edict of Milan in 1313 AD gave Christianity a legal status in the Roman Empire, that to be an Armenian was to be a Christian, acknowledging the headship of a Catholicos, the title used for the head of the Armenian Church, and recognizing a confession of faith and forms of worship and liturgy, written, spoken, and sung in Armenian. The reality, however, is that Armenian identity was continually evolving, open to revision and reimagination. What it meant to be Armenian in the 7th century, therefore, was not the same as what it meant to be Armenian in the 10th century or the 17th century, just as what it meant to be Armenian at any one moment in time will have differed from district to district and from community to community. The different expressions of Armenianness that emerged, coexisted, and vanished over the centuries bear witness to the complex and often turbulent historical experience of Armenians as they engaged with and responded to intrusive hegemonic powers, regional authorities, and local rivals, and reflect the movements of communities and the development of commercial networks down to the present day. So here he's sort of, in the first half, he's describing exactly the situation of the building blocks and how this has, it's tended to be a rather sort of a stale impression of what Armenianness means or meant in the Middle Ages. Instead, he's trying to argue that we should have a more dynamic view that includes regional difference, that includes a consideration of power dynamics with empires that were surrounding Armenia, and an appreciation of all these things when we look at medieval Armenian art. And here, interestingly, he mentions, I put this quotation here because we've just looked at Vardam Mamikonian's example. Here he stresses how the legacy of Vardam Mamikonian is actually honoured by Persians as well, and how he has a different significance as a man of courage who assisted the lord of Iran, that is the Persian king, and that the memory of his greatest actions persists in the land of Iran. So that's also interesting in terms of a focus, sort of reorientating the relationship of Armenians with, in particular, Muslim or Zoroastrian powers that were formerly depicted to be the diametric opposite to Armenians who were the sort of heroes of the story. So how can we revisit Armenian medieval culture with this idea of Tim Greenwood in mind? Looking at the most famous example of Armenian medieval architecture, the Echmiadzin Cathedral, we can immediately identify what we traditionally view to be the symbols of Armenian identity through architecture. So the conical dome, for instance, is the key symbol of Armenian difference. No other medieval church architecture has that shaped dome. And in fact, most of the Armenian churches built elsewhere have different shaped domes. So it's exclusively associated with the medieval Armenian legacy, let's say. Looking at the plan, also you have a cruciform plan with semi-domed apses here. And this cruciform plan that was surmounted by the conical dome comes together to be a sort of classical formulation of Armenian medieval identity that was repeated much later, as we'll see later in the course. This is the result of historical circumstances in a way. People like Christina Morangi have looked at the early 20th century and at the work of art historians working in Central Europe, like Joseph Strugowski, who were promoting an image of Armenian architecture as Aryan architecture. So they wanted to depict Armenian architecture as culturally distinct from Mediterranean architecture and as an inheritor of Persian traditions in architecture. So a lot of this, sort of the narrowness of our vision of medieval Armenian architecture comes from this early 20th century Central European scholarship. It's not just the reflection of Armenians' own understanding, it's a sort of imposition from outside as well. So that was Christina Morangi who wrote about that in her first book. So a number of other art historians have tried to draw attention instead, as Tim Greenwood had urged us to the connections of Armenian medieval architecture instead. So how can we show, instead of focusing on the conical dome that we can still see here in the church of Aksamar Island in Lake Van, so we can still see its distinctive marker of Armenian identity, but we can also see some other connections within the architecture. So art historians like Lynn Jones have focused on interpreting the iconography, which is the symbolism of the carvings on the Aksamar Cathedral, and she has interpreted this depiction of the Armenian king as a reflection of the translation of the kind of depiction of a Muslim ruler or the Abbasid caliph onto the Armenian cathedral. And she says this is an image that's been directly lifted from Islamic court culture, Abbasid court culture, particularly because of his folded legs, because he has this goblet of wine held here, and also because of some other figures that have turbans on. Some other images, in contrast, have costume that is more closely related to Byzantine iconography too. So the different aspects of the carvings that you look at can draw out the connections in different ways. So looking to the Islamic empires, but also looking to the contemporary Christian empires elsewhere, and to what extent these were borrowed. Here's just a quick example to show this typical seated, cross-legged posture that was popular within Islamic courtly iconography. This is a ivory pyxis from the Islamic capital Madinah al-Zahra in Spain from 969 to 970. I think it's also important to mention how all of this this sort of narrowness in how we appreciate Armenian medieval culture is born out of the situation that all of these monuments are at risk, and the few monuments that do survive are still at risk, particularly those in Western Armenia or in elsewhere, Azerbaijan, Nakhchivan, and so on. So how does this impact? This is something we might want to come back to in the discussion. How does this precarious situation of medieval monuments impact on the way that we view them and the aspects that we prioritise in terms of their value, their material value or aesthetic value? And to this area, as a student of Islamic art and Islamic architectural history, I focused on the Ottoman Empire, realised that there was a huge gap in the study of Ottoman art and architecture concerning the role of Armenians within that artistic production. So my background isn't as an Armenian studies person. I haven't been trained in Armenian studies. So I put the course together primarily looking at other Armenian studies syllabi and thinking how I can relate it to my own expertise as an art and architectural historian, and also how can I try and revisit some of the things that appear to me a bit problematic. So yeah, I'm very open to feedback in terms of how I can rethink it for the future. At the moment, it's sort of conceptualized in terms of how I can communicate all these things to my students, who are primarily sort of 20-year-old British people from small villages in Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. So that's where I'm coming from really with this course. So it's interesting now to present it on such a different stage and to have to revisit these ideas with a very different audience and perhaps a very critical audience. So I look forward to that part, so I'll skip through now. Now I've planned to spend the second hour talking about early modern Armenian culture, particularly in New Julfa and in India. So again, I want to give some sort of theoretical background and try to revisit this theoretical background in terms of how we can view the cultural interactions that we see through the artistic productions in these communities. I found it problematic when I was reading traditional histories of the Armenian diaspora, particularly focusing on the early modern communities. The term colonies was often used, and to me that didn't seem to appreciate the degree of interaction between the Armenians and the, let's say, host culture. So I found it problematic, that the use of that term. Perhaps it has a more positive ramification in Armenian, I'm not sure, but in British English it's sort of a bit jarring for me to hear these communities described as colonies. And so I thought, how can we try to appreciate the fruitful and multi-layered interactions and the sincere attachments that these communities did have with the cultures that were hosting them. Well, even the word host sounds a bit problematic. Also within the history of cross-cultural trade and trade diasporas, the way that these Armenian communities are referred to is also quite problematic. So not just within the Armenian historiography, which has tended to view them as these sort of colonies before the moment of awakening and rediscovery of true Armenian identity in the 19th century. So even within the work of people like British historian Philip D. Curtin, he tends to view these Armenians as sort of, split off from the mainstream somehow. They're within their own community. They might have a special status. They might have some sort of privileges, but at the same time they're not part of the political activity or part of the cultural society of the mainstream. And he also seems to view it as inevitable that they would keep their Armenianness, or at least recover it at some point. So they always want to be returning to Armenianness somehow, and if they don't, then that's a sort of a problem somehow. So it's refreshing to see more recent work by people like Sebu Aslanian, who've introduced ideas like the circulation society as an antidote to the colony, because on a basic level, circulation society foregrounds this idea of movement, interaction, and it doesn't view the Armenian communities as cut off or as having a tendency to retain their Armenianness that's viewed to be implicit or anything like that. Instead, they can freely interact, they can freely evolve, they can change, assimilate, adapt. They produced, as he says, a hybrid culture, an identity that allowed them to bridge all these different trading posts or trading communities that were spread around the world that he studied. You all know the story. I thought we would look firstly at New Julfa, and then we'll look at India and try to think about these ideas of sort of trade colony, circulation society. How can we apply these ideas to the material culture? What are they reflective of? So you all know the story, I'm sure, of the relocation of the Armenians from Old Julfa to the princely suburb outside of Isfahan, New Julfa, across the river. And obviously the violence that was the precursor to this, and the scorched earth policy of relocating the Armenians to have control over the silk trade as a result of the Ottoman-Safavid rivalry of the time. So the Armenians were transported to New Julfa, but at the same time, the narrative goes that they were given this special status. They had a degree of autonomy. They had, as Bagdians McCabe argues, a merchant suburb or a city-state. So they had some sort of political ability, as well as a hierarchy that was connected to the Safavid state. And they also had some members that were able to attend the court of the Safavid Shah as well. So that there are some indications already in the work of Bagdians McCabe and others that members of this community had an incredibly elevated status, that they weren't just people who a certain aspect of trade was delegated to. They actually interacted within the Shah's court on a relatively even keel with other attendees of the court. So how might this be reflected in the material culture, this interaction at court, and the very high status of Persian Armenians in the Safavid hierarchy, through their houses? Some recent works have looked to Armenian mansions, some of which were situated along the avenue, the Chahabah Four Gardens Avenue, that was linking Isfahan with the suburb of New Julfa. So these hugely luxurious, extravagant mansions were constructed in areas like this that were not hidden away. This is one example that shows a layout that was reminiscent of Persian royal palaces. So you have this open colonnade that precedes the palace. Some other examples show architectural interaction and decorative interaction on a further level between Armenian nobles and the Persian court. So again, this is a style that you would see from Persian architecture, with it's got these open spaces called iwans that are like sort of open projecting spaces that usually have a pointed arch and a vault over them. So there are a few of these spaces in this house that are coming from Persian architecture, specifically Persian palace architecture. And also you can see obviously this brick decoration here that has these sort of interlocking hexagons, and the pointed arch itself is associated with Islamic architecture as well, as opposed to the rounded arch that comes from the Roman tradition. And again, on the interior you can see a number of paintings that are quite similar to those that were produced in the court at the time, that were looking to European styles, both in the Armenian community and in the Safavid Shah's court. This is just another example of the Armenian merchant's house. The dome looks like it's recreating a Persian mosque dome, but on an Armenian merchant's house. And these these niches, again, recreate something that you see within Persian religious and secular architecture. Another example, so this is a work of comparison. So this is a palace that was associated with the Safavid Muslim rulers. And you can see, as I mentioned before, it has this open portico, and you have the carved niches here. You have similar paintings to what you saw in the Armenian noble house here within these pointed arches. So there are lots of formal similarities that show spillover between the Safavid courtly style and the Armenian community, in particular the Armenian nobles. So that shows in itself circulation of ideas, circulation of how to decorate a house, how to build a house. There were ideas both within the Armenian community and within the Persian Muslim elites that this was something that was fashionable, that you would have full-length portraits within pointed arch niches, that you would have these carved niches, decorative carved niches within the house as well, and that you would have an open portico running in front of the house and a iwan or a recess inside. So all these features, both decorative features and architectural features, you see all over the domestic architecture of the elites, whether Muslim or Armenian Christian. The All Saviours Cathedral, or Hamaink Cathedral in New Julfa, is often described in terms of how it preserves the features of Armenian architecture. So it definitely does have several features, noticeable features when you're looking at it from the outside, that are taken from Armenian medieval architecture. It has obviously the conical dome there on the bell tower, and it has a central dome, although the dome itself is more a sort of onion dome than you would typically see in an Armenian church. So the dome's profile has taken on the aspect of a Persian-shaped dome through the way that it's built and designed. You can see, if you go to the plan of the building as well, there, that the church does have a sort of cruciform plan, so it does have a cross-shaped plan. It's not centrally planned like a mosque would be. So the architectural form itself, that is the ground plan, by and large is recognisable as a church, and an Armenian church at that. But from various aspects of the exterior and the interior, you can see that it was highly influenced by the Persian contemporary architectural culture too. So although it has an entrance inscription that says the name and the date of the church, this is within tiled mosaic decoration, which was popular within Persian mosque decoration. You can see that, again, the brick is used to make decorative motifs, as it would be on Persian mosques, unlike stone carved architecture in Armenian medieval churches. But the biggest, and I should also mention things like the pointed arches too, of the exterior. You can see these pointed arches. There are round arches down here, but many of them are pointed arches up there. The biggest overlap between the All Saviours Cathedral and Persian Muslim architecture is the dome, however. The dome looks absolutely like something that was mimicking Persian manuscript paintings. Sometimes they had this medallion composition in Persian and also in Ottoman manuscript painting, which looks quite similar to this. And also, if you look to the Persian mosque decoration, this is a blue version, which perhaps isn't as similar as it could be, but nevertheless, I think you can see the relationship of these swirling floral patterns. and also the mixture between the metallic shades, and in here blue, but also in the other one sort of reds as well as blues. So many of the decorative aspects show overlap between the Persian imperial and elite culture. But then if you look to the lower aspects of the walls, the lower levels of the walls, the Christian identity of the cathedral becomes clearer because you have these monumental paintings of the Gospels and the torments of St. Gregory the Illuminator. And scholars like Sarah Laporte Eftekharian have identified that many of these paintings come from, many of these compositions of these Christian paintings come from woodcuts that were printed in Amsterdam and were then circulated through the Armenian trade communities, trade nodes, and the merchant networks. So again, it's interesting that there's this fusion of interaction with the Persian Muslim court and the religious architecture of the Persian court. And there's also an interaction between the mobility of the merchant network through the use of these artistic models of the woodcuts that were circulated in the Bibles that came from Amsterdam but were widely distributed through the trade networks of the New Deal for Armenians. So that relates back to the point of the circulation societies of Sebu Aslanian and how these impacted on the material culture that was produced. So next we'll move on to Armenians in India. We'll just look at the architecture of the church and one of the churches and some textiles that will again hopefully help us to revisit ideas about Armenian medieval and early modern material culture. So you all know the story of the Armenians in India, most likely. There were earlier communities that were serving the Mughal emperors, but then there were much bigger migrations when the situation got less comfortable for the New Julfan Armenians in Persia, so many migrated from there and relocated to India. And there was a even stronger position that was achieved through making agreements with the East India Company of Britain in the 17th century. So we can see particularly churches were built around this time in India, in Armenian communities. So we'll focus on the Armenian church in Madras, which was constructed around 1712, rebuilt 1772. I don't have fantastic pictures of this. I just have pictures from Google, unfortunately, because I've never been there. So we can just see some general aspects of the exterior and interior, which show, again, there are some aspects that can be identified as Armenian, a conical sort of dome there. I don't have the ground plan, but it does look to be cruciform from some of these images. But here, much of the stylistic aspects of the decoration look more neoclassical than you would typically see within an Armenian church. And this is the interior here, so you have a nave and then presumably a transept. I find this quotation particularly interesting in terms of allowing us to enter into the mindset of the Armenian community in Madras. It's a quotation that was recorded in Seth's History of the Armenians of India, where he's compiled an entire history of the community, which is now freely available on archive.org, so you can all go and download it after this course. So he states, in quotes, he has quite direct connections to the community, so I think he probably heard this impression passed down through oral histories. So he states, excuse me, it was one of the few magnificent edifices in the esplanade of that city, but the Armenians were obliged to desert it after a time as the British authorities would not permit so high an edifice to stand in the immediate vicinity of the fort. So again, an Armenian church has to sort of balance the fact that it's an expression of the community, it's allowed to be constructed in many cases because of a favourable relationship with the imperial master of that locality, but at the same time it has to tread quite a sort of narrow line in terms of how far it can express the power and the revival of the community, because it will always be observed as a potential rival symbol to the palace of the government house of the British or the palace of the Safavid Shah. But nevertheless, I think you can see from the tower that it's quite a striking building here, so I'm not surprised that Seth is stating that the British were quite worried about it as a statement of the power of the community. But it's significant that the bell tower has a rounded dome rather than the Armenian dome on the church itself is much shorter than the bell tower dome. So perhaps that's significant that this was an effort to blend in to some extent in terms of the style of it. Because as you can see here, the Fort St George of the British itself has a rounded dome. So the fact that they built the bell tower here with a rounded dome, neoclassical style dome, was itself mirroring the architecture of the Fort St George to some extent. So again, we can say that just like in New Julfa, there was some overlap between the style of the British and the Armenians in Madras. Whether that was just the result of the builders who were employed and sort of pragmatic reasons, or whether that was a deliberate choice to make it resemble that, I think not enough research has yet been carried out to tell us that answer. But it's certainly something interesting for future research. So here you can see the location, how central it was in relation to the Fort St George, which was a sort of stronghold of the British there. So it was right in this this area that was close to the fort there. And you can see from this painting and engraving the general neoclassical style of the British buildings at that time. So the Armenian church was largely fitting in, let's say, within the master's culture within that context. The textiles that were produced, Dikran Kuyumjian wrote an article about these textiles, and they're just absolutely mind-blowing. I don't know if you've seen them before, but they are a fantastic fusion of Armenian iconography, perhaps coming from manuscript illumination models, and some scenes are coming from Armenian medieval sources for sure, but there are also local Indian elements that are incorporated, and the figures are very much, some of these figures are really depicted in a style that is akin to Indian art at the time. So they're really interesting in terms of how far Armenianness was retained, how far local culture was incorporated into the designs. And again, we don't know what this was a reflection of, but we think it's probably related to who made them, because in most cases it seems that, as it says here, Indian artisans would have actually produced the curtains, but they would have been perhaps made by bringing together different models, and some of those models could have been Armenian manuscripts or other Armenian textiles. So let's just look at some examples. The Dead Christ and Scenes of the Passion, all around the edge. The sort of tomb that Christ is lying on is also quite like a sort of Indian temple, which is interesting again in terms of even within Indian Islamic art, you have this tension between pre-existing Indian religious art and the incoming Islamic Persianate decorative tradition. So it's interesting that the pre-Islamic Indian temple architecture seems to be being represented here in the textiles. So it survived through the Islamic, the Mughal period into Armenian textiles. And here you've got St. Gregory and his successors, the father of the Armenian church. Painted and dyed cotton is this one. So the other one was, let's see what, I think most of them are cotton. And these are two examples that again show quite open Indian stylistic models. This one in particular looks just like a Mughal Persian Islamic miniature painting. It looks a bit like a famous painting of Shah Jahan. This is of St. John the Baptist with the Lamb of God, painted and dyed cotton, and this is botanical Armenian church altar curtain. We're at the main altar of St. Tauros or Theodorus in Jerusalem. And it's interesting that many of these are now in Echmiadzin or Jerusalem, so I guess that they don't see the light of day very often. Okay, so I thought we would just finish there. I was going to discuss Joseph Emin, but I think we'll just leave it with the material culture and leave that for another day, because I think it would be nice to have a long discussion now instead.